Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Glad to have you here. Thank you so much for joining. And we're going to bring up the deck right now and get right into it. All right, here we go. So today we're going to be talking about how to give guests and hosts a great experience. And this topic is really important because guests and hosts can be some of our greatest podcast ambassadors. So we're going to be covering how to select hosts and select guests, what to think about, and then also how to, or specific advice and specific tactics to give them a great experience before the interview, during the interview, and after the interview. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ananya Zachariah. And Ananya is right here, and she is a part of Rice University, specifically the Rice Business School. She's the assistant manager of marketing and communication. Ananya, I'm going to let you say hello and also say a few words about what I'll Have You Know is, which is the podcast from Rice Business.
Sure. Hi. I guess I don't see anyone right now, but nice to be with you all today. I'm Ananya Zachariah. As Robert said, I'm the assistant manager of marketing and communication at Rice Business. And I have been lead of our podcast, I'll Have You Know, since we took it over from our external relations team in June of last year. And since then, in partnership with Robert and his team at University FM, we've grown our listeners significantly. We've increased awareness for the podcast in the Rice community. We've also won an award. So it's been a really fun and fulfilling experience, and I'm excited to talk to you all today and share some insights.
Awesome. Ananya is really one of the superstars behind the podcast. She does a lot for it. So appreciate having you here. All right. Before we go any further, on the next slide, just want to mention that there is a takeaway doc, so a worksheet that you can take notes in, and also just participate while we go along with today's session. There's going to be a link in the chat pretty soon. Otherwise, you can scan that QR code in the bottom left-hand corner, which is always going to be there. So scan it anytime. Again, this is a takeaway doc for use during this session so that you can have some really good takeaways to bring back to your own podcast. All right. So the flow for today, we go to the next one. So the flow for today is we're going to be talking about the host experience first, and then the guest experience, and then overall how to cultivate long-term relationships. So the structure is going to be similar between the host and guest experience. We're going to be talking about the types of hosts and guests that we've encountered. So for Rice, I'll Have You Know, Rice Business specifically, and also I'll be talking about a few other examples. Some of the selection criteria to consider when deciding, who would be a good person to include or not so good, depending on what the institutional goals or the podcast goals are. And then finally, very specific tactics that we use to give a smooth experience. I'll also say that during this session, if you have any questions, please just send a message in the chat and we'll get to it at any time. So you don't have to wait till the end. All right. The first piece we're going to talk about is the types of hosts. So we're summarizing here today as student hosts, faculty, staff, and alumni hosts. And on the top right, you can see a few different shows there. So Rose Pod is from Rose-Hulman University, where their hosts are student workers, actually between two student workers. All's Equal is a finance business decision-making podcast over at Stanford School of Business, and that's hosted by two finance professors. Leeds Business Insights is a podcast over at the Leeds School of Business over at University of Colorado Boulder, and that is an example of a staff host, specifically the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement, and then finally you have Rice Business, and I'll let Nai talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, but that's two alumni hosts. So depending on the type of host, it implies a different type of working relationship, right? And depending on the type of host, there's a slightly different preferences that they would have. So for the student workers, this is interesting. So this is coming from the the Office of Admissions, and the student workers, it's actually their idea to do the podcast. And for the selection here, they wanted students because they want students to speak about the student experience for prospective students. For professors, all else equal, they wanted to have this podcast as a way to elevate their own personal brands, but also to bring insights from research to a broader audience. And then the Leeds Business Insights staff member, this choice made sense because for them, the staff member here, Amanda Kramer, she would be staying at the university for a long amount of time, and also very well aligned with their own alumni office goals. So that's why they chose her. And Ananya, I'll let you speak a little bit about how Maya and Scott here, we can see in the bottom, got chosen as the host for Odd We Know. But even before that, a little bit of history of the original hosts.
Yeah. So our podcast, I Will Have You Know, launched in 2020, and it was thanks to our alumni board. So the alumni board made the decision to select alumni hosts, and they selected 2 alumni hosts, Christine Dobbin and David Drucleaver, and they were amazing and put a lot of hard work into the show. But it is an unpaid volunteer position at Rice Business. So when the time came for our team, marketing and communication, to take over the podcast, both hosts indicated that they were ready to pass the baton. So that kicked off a search process for us for new hosts. And we decided to stick with having 2 hosts because that frees us up in terms of scheduling. So if one host isn't able to do an interview, then the other host can, and we're not constrained in that way. We also like having 2 because we have people that have different backgrounds, so it adds variety to the episodes. And we wanted to stick with alums because they are really familiar with our school and they know our culture, and they're great brand ambassadors for us. So in our search process, we sought recommendations from our alumni board since they created the podcast. We also talked extensively with our alumni relations team, and we had multiple people that they recommended. We had multiple conversations with those people. And over the course of time, that led us to Maya Pomeroy and Scott Gale, who you see on the screen there. They're really incredible. When we were considering how to select them, speaking experience is really important to us because we wanted people that could hit the ground running. We wanted to ensure they had a good relationship to the school, that they have a good demeanor in conversations with our guests. So they're calm, talking to strangers, they're comfortable, they're light on their feet. We wanted to make sure that their intentions are really aligned with ours. So as I mentioned, it's an unpaid volunteer position. So we want to make sure we're selecting people that find this experience fulfilling and fun, and it's something they're going to enjoy doing and taking time out of their schedule to do. And we also needed to make sure it's people that with their day job have a certain degree of flexibility in terms of scheduling. So people that are more advanced in their careers and have agency. And so that led us to Maya and Scott, who are 2 alums of our executive MBA program. And they're really amazing. They both have great speaking experience. Scott has his own podcast, and Maya actually used to be in broadcast journalism. So we really lucked out with both of them. They also have really impressive careers, so that adds a really great dimension to their conversations with our guests.
And Ananya, from your perspective, why do you think Maya and Scott want to be volunteers for this?
I think they both really love speaking to people. They love storytelling. Maya is the founder of The Public Lead, so she has her own, it's a broadcast media firm. So clearly it's something really important to her. And with Scott, as I mentioned, he has his own podcast. It's already something he's interested in. He does voice actor work too on the side, in addition to being the executive director of Halliburton Labs. So don't know how he balances it all, but really impressive. So I think just storytelling is something they're both really passionate about, and they also are very supportive and involved with the school. So I think they care a lot about Rice Business as a school. They care about our programs, and so they want to be they want to give back, and they want to contribute to the success of our school.
Right. So just to hone in 2 points here. or if I can just give my view on the selection criteria. So speaking experience, that is something that can be trained for sure. And if as long as you have somebody who's passionate and mission aligned with what the podcast, what the school is trying to achieve, okay, speaking can be practiced, improved on. So that brings me to this point, the points 2 and 4, relationship to the school, intentions, that's really what we want to look out for. Are the intentions matching up? Are the missions and values aligned? And is the vision for the podcast and long term aligned as well? As long as those pieces fit in, then okay, we can work on speaking experience, and great, you have some good candidates for hosts. And that last bullet point is a good final check, because availability is a huge deal, especially if you're doing a guest podcast. And the easier or the more flexible people can be their schedule, the easier it'll be on the production end, easier for your own life in making this show. All right, so we got a question here from Chelsea Clark. Ananya, how do you and the host work together to prepare the guests? I'm especially curious about the guests who don't speak publicly often and need help getting comfortable. All right, so we're going to hold that question because we're going to get into that next in 2 slides, I'd say. All right, so we'll come back to that. We can go on. So focusing on the smooth experience. So this slide's a little busy, but let's just focus on the left hand first. So talking about the recording setup, so we want to make it as easy as possible for the host to do their hosting, to just focus on that aspect of the job and not have to worry about anything on the technical side. So there's really 2 situations for recording interviews. One is a remote recording, and the other is an in-person recording. Remote recordings, our process is that we always have a producer assigned to each show. So the producer will set up the recording studio, and we use Riverside.fm, and the producer will always be sitting in on those recordings to help with tech and sound checks or anything else that comes up. When it's a in-person experience, and kind of the similar aspects, we handle all of the planning logistically, getting the room set up, ushering people in. Ananya could probably talk about this more later. But really overall, it's just making it as easy as possible for the host to just focus on the interviewing aspect. So another part of that is these coaching and prep docs. So with every single conversation, we're always taking notes on what the host could improve on, specific to them. Maybe there's some specific speaking or vocal tics, or some coaching around how they frame questions, just a variety of interviewing tactics. So we would help them along the process, just improve over time. Prep docs, now this is really important, and I'm gonna let Ananya talk about this. So on the right-hand side is an example prep doc that we prepared for this particular guest, Jillian Fink. And there's a few components here. And Ananya, why these components? How did these sections come into place?
Yeah, so with our prep documents, we want to be as helpful as possible to our hosts. So since for Owl Have You Know, we have alumni volunteer hosts. We want to make sure that they don't have to take too much of their own time doing research. We want to give them everything that they would really need. And so we've created this prep document, and I do all of the research. And so first we have the high-level overview. So that is to give the host a sense of the broader goals for the conversation so they can keep that in mind when they're speaking with the guest. And then we give them a detailed bio, so they have all of the background information on the guest. Then we have some useful links in case the host wants to dig deeper on their own time. They can go kind of as deep as they want. For Owl Have You Know, we have 3 categories for our guests that we kind of split them into that relates to the kind of story we're telling. So for example, we have flight path, and that's a category for guests that are going to talk about building success over the course of their careers. Then we have the pivot category, and that's for guests that really had this inflection point, this moment of transformation in their careers. And then up next is for expert guests that are going to dive deep on a particular topic. So with that in mind, we'll select a particular category for the guest and we let the host know so that they, again, have a sense of where to steer the conversation. And then I will create a list of questions for the host. And we always want to assure in the conversations between the guest and host that there is a particular focus. We don't want to cover too many topics in one conversation. We want it to be really directed. But we do want to ask interesting questions that will kind of dig deeper into a guest's life and maybe bring out a personal story as much as they're comfortable with and get them to open up and share like the human side of their life. So, but with the questions, we also always make sure to remind our hosts that they are just suggestions. We want our hosts to feel autonomy and agency when they're speaking to our guests, and just in the process in general. We want them to feel like they're in partnership with us because it is a volunteer role, and we don't want them to feel like it's an assignment at all. We want to be collaborators. So it's always just suggestions, thought starters for the conversation, and then we trust our hosts to take that wherever they want to go. If the conversation ends up going in a different direction than what we intended, then we trust them to follow that and get the most interesting story.
And even if the hosts are not volunteers, but paid positions, the same applies. Want to make sure that it's a partnership type of experience where the host has a voice in how to guide the conversation, not feeling like they have to read off the script, not feeling too restricted on what they can talk about. Side note, there's always this great aspect of podcasting, the post-production process, where if there's parts of the conversation that for whatever reason should be cut out, we can do that pretty easily, right? Whether that's to save time or just to focus more specifically on this North Star interview, or if there's any, generally speaking, like mess ups, right? So that takes the pressure off of the host and also the guest, and make sure that the final output of the podcast interview is really clear and succinct. All right. So we're going to move on to the guest experience now. So same type of format here. When it comes to guests, at the very high level, it's helpful to think about internal versus external guests, and then in this process, collaborating with potentially other departments in the school to source guest ideas that are relevant to the core mission of the podcast. So those same podcast examples that were brought up before, for RosePod, they're focused on student guests and program leads. For All Sequel, they're focused on academics and researchers. For Leeds Business Insights, they're focused on featuring their own faculty and relevant research for what's happening in the world today. And then Rice Business, we have alumni listed here because it's initially started out as a alumni-specific podcast, but is now expanded. And with each of these types of guests, right, they're all closely aligned with what the podcast is trying to achieve. So, Ananya, tell us a little bit about how it started from a one podcast and has gradually transitioned into more of a general podcast.
Yeah, so it started out, as you said, as an alumni podcast with really only alumni guests. And since we've taken it on, one of our goals has been to tie the podcast more into Rice University as a whole. So not just constrained within the Rice business community, but really ties into the larger Rice family. So we have been expanding our outreach a lot and bringing faculty more into the fold and different people from the Rice community. So for example, the episode that you see on the screen, the image is from our episode with our dean, Peter Rodriguez, but then also the woman in the middle is Allison Weaver, who is the founding executive director of the Moody Center for the Arts. And so they got together to speak about our public art initiative at Rice University as a whole, but specifically within Rice Business and McNair Hall. So that was a really cool episode, but that's just an example of one of the ways that we've really expanded. But Robert, do you want me to talk a little bit about selection? And does that go to Chelsea's question? Could you say it again for me? I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, we can go into selection. But Chelsea's question is, how do you and the host work together to prepare the guests?
Okay, so maybe that's more on the next slide. Okay, got it. Okay, well, for selection, before the start of production on a new season, something we have started doing is having a brainstorming session. So we will include key members of our team, the marketing and communication team, and then your team, University FM, and then also someone from our alumni relations team because they know our alumni so well and have a better sense of that. And we always try to identify a few priorities for this season. So as you were kind of mentioning, there are key stories we want to tell, key themes for the season, and usually it ties to our brand pillars. So for example, for Rice Business, two of our brand pillars are entrepreneurship and at the energy transition. And so that has been really important for us recently. We want to tell stories around that. So we will keep that in mind when we're brainstorming guests. As I mentioned, another goal has been to tie the podcast into larger Rice. So that's also something we keep in mind when we're thinking about guest selection. And then we also always try to keep in mind the target audience. So for Owl Have You Know, it used to be very alumni focused, so alumni guests, and the intended audience was alumni. Since we've taken it on, we really want to use it as a tool to reach more people and share our stories in a broader way. And so now we've altered our target audience, and now it's more prospective students. And alumni are still definitely an intended audience, but more of secondary, and prospective students are the main focus. So with that in mind, we want to make sure that the content is relevant and engaging for prospective students. And then also diverse representation. Diversity is really important to our school. We are located in Houston. It's the fourth most diverse city in the US. So we, of course, want that to bleed into our podcast, and we want to showcase that. And with our guests, similar to our hosts, we want to make sure that we're featuring people that have good intentions. So our podcast is not a platform for people to come on and advertise their business or sell a product. It's about storytelling. So we want to make sure that we're bringing on people that have stories to share, and that's their primary focus.
Fantastic. I don't have anything to add there. All right, so let's get into the smooth experience aspect. All right. Okay, this slide getting a little busy, but let's focus on the left hand. So we're going to start with the intentional outreach and easy scheduling. So the image on the bottom left is, the image on the bottom left is an example email outreach that Ananya sends to potential guests. And Ananya, I'll let you break down this email.
Okay. Hold on, let me zoom in a little more. So with our outreach to guests, because it is still primarily alumni, and that's a relationship that is really important to the school, we want to be careful. We don't want to be overwhelming because our alums get a lot of emails from us. So we want to make sure that it is brief and concise, and we're not giving them too much information. So you'll see that it's a pretty short email. But we want our ask to be specific so they know what we want them to speak about on the podcast. It's not like a mystery to them. And we also want to make sure that they know they were an intentional choice for us. They're not one in a batch of people that we're reaching out to. We selected them for a reason. So you'll see this segment that's highlighted is kind of the part that I will tailor to each person. So in this one, you'll see I mentioned that this person is the global supply manager at Tesla, and we want them to speak about that and their previous experience in the energy industry. They made a move from Indonesia to Texas to California, so that's an interesting aspect that we want them to touch on in the conversation. So we really try to tie in as many specific things from their background as we can, obviously while still keeping a focus to what we want them to speak about. But yeah, we try to make this as personal as possible. And then we'll follow up with more information if they say they're interested. So that's the point where we would reach out with scheduling information and more details about the recording.
Yeah, so I think it's an important point here. The more intentional you can be with outreach, the more special the guest will feel, the recipient will feel, and the more likely that they will be open to being a guest on the show. So what usually follows after this is that people say, yeah, of course, let's get on the show. I'd love to be on the show. And we would send them a follow-up email, or Nanya does this with the scheduling link. For I'll have you know, the tool being used is Calendly, so one of the many calendar scheduling tools out there, and making it easy for the guests to just click that link, pick their show time slot, and that's really it from the guest side. And then they would get something like this image on the right. So they would get an interview prep checklist. And this prep checklist would go through how they should set up their environment, like technically, but also just the room they're in, some tips there. If they've never used Riverside FM before as a remote recording tool, there's information about how to easily get in. And then some other general conversational tips that follow at the second half of the document. So for the guests, the flow is they get this email outreach. They say yes, and then they schedule their time, and then they get this interview prep checklist. At that point, they have an option to have a pre-call. So pre-calls, it's like a remote interview. It's scheduling, say, up to 15 minutes, just to check in with the guests to see if they have any general questions, and also just to do a preliminary tech check. So it just puts them at ease before the actual interview day. Something similar happens as well with the in-person experience. So in that last slide, that was an in-person recording, right? And Ananya, would love for you to share a little bit about how you crafted the in-person experience for the guests.
Yeah, so that was a great one because we got permission from Moody to film in their building. So I think it was a really cool, unique, inviting environment, which is really important. You want the guests to feel like, as you say here in your slide, in-person experience, you want it to be welcoming and inviting, and the space definitely was. But also to help our guests feel comfortable for in-person recordings when there's the video component, we always do an hour-long prep call. So that's long. For our virtual ones, as you were saying, there's the 15-minute one that your team will manage. But for an in-person one, we extend that quite a bit because we know people feel more self-conscious when they're on video. They're going to feel like the stakes are a bit higher. So we want them to feel as comfortable as possible. We want them to feel like they already kind of have a sense for the conversation. Obviously, we never want anything to be too rehearsed, so we're not going to give them all the questions ahead of time. We never do that, but we will touch on in the prep call the main broader points for the conversation and kind of talk through it with them. And then the host is always included on those calls because we want to start establishing the rapport between them. We want that to kind of already exist before the recording actually takes place.
And so that partly answers Chelsea's question. So how do you and host work together to prepare the guests? I'll also say prior to even this outreach stage, the hosts are involved in the guest selection process as well. So they would recommend names, and if there's any input that we would want that we need, then the hosts offer that as well. So hosts are involved in the guest selection process. They're involved in different levels with the putting guests at ease, just building that rapport before an interview. And then in some cases, I'll mention, for really high profile guests, there might be asked to share questions ahead of time. So sometimes we do that, but we don't share all the questions, right? Because we also don't want the guests to be over prepped for it. So those are just some ways that hosts work with us to make the experience a little better for the guest. And I'll use another example as well. So there's a podcast over at Stanford GSB that's called Think Fast, Talk Smart. It's hosted by Matt Abrahams, who's a communications professor there. And for their interviews, their in-person sessions, they had this comment that when they were first doing in-person interviews, the welcome room was really cold and just plain and not inviting at all. So they made very intentional changes to warm up the physical space so that the guests felt more at ease. So,
just something to add to answer Chelsea's question, because I know she was specifically also asking about guests that don't feel comfortable naturally. I think that is an area where we really lean on our alumni relations team for vetting. And I think that's something we would want to make sure beforehand that we're selecting people that do have a certain degree of comfortability talking and sharing their story, just because it won't do the guest or the podcast any benefit to have someone on who feels uncomfortable about that and isn't inclined towards that sort of thing. So I think we also work very closely with alumni relations for I Will Have You Know, at least, to make sure that it's people that we know are comfortable and at least somewhat gifted at telling their story. I hope that answers the question, Chelsea.
Cool. All right, so let's move on. All right, next here, so cultivating long-term relationships. We'll get to Francis' question in a second. I see that there. So cultivating long-term relationships. So this is a broad overview of the touch points that happened before, during, and after interview. So just focusing on the after part for now. For the guest side, we always recommend and just put as a best practice to send a thank you message once the episode is, well, after interview, and also once the episode is published. So the example here on the right is from Ananya to Danielle once the episode is published. So Ananya, can you break down how this is structured?
Yeah, so I share a link to the episode. We have our podcast housed in our website. It's also, of course, on every podcast platform, but in this email, we link to the one on our site. And then we post the episode across all of our social media platforms. So you'll see I link to every single platform that we've posted on. And we also feature the episode typically on the homepage of our site, so I'll usually include that link as well. And we ask that they reshare our posts or create their own, and so we also give them access to our Google Drive folder that has their specific social media assets. So if they don't want to reshare ours, if they want to adjust the caption copy, they can do that. And then what's not pictured here, but we also always ask for feedback or guest recommendations. So we want to try to keep the conversation going if possible. Of course, we don't always hear back, but that's our intention.
Yeah, overall is to make sure that the experience from start to finish is a great one. And once the episode's published, making them feel special in different ways. As a side note, every so often, so for some shows, there's kind of we bring episodes back, so like bringing back old episodes, and in those cases, again, tagging and informing the guests, right? So let me use another example here for cultivating long-term relationships. There's a podcast over at Haas over at UC Berkeley. It's called One Haas, and part of the strategy for their podcast is alumni podcast. Part of the strategy there is to cultivate like donor engagement. So the podcast served as a way to have an opportunity for the alumni guests to share their story and the impact and like their vision for the future. And then there were follow-ups after that interview that eventually accumulated, a year later into a pretty sizable donation for the school. So this, the experience of being invited to be on the school's podcast is only seen as a privilege. So talking about the host side now, for hosts, we have frequent check-ins with them, and same deal, proactively ask for feedback, but again, re-emphasizing the importance of giving them a voice. So Ananya, can you talk a little bit about how we do these check-ins with Maya and Scott?
Yeah, so at the beginning, when we started working with them, we had bi-weekly check-ins. And we continued that for a while to make sure that they felt like they had an often enough opportunity to talk to us and give us feedback, because we want to be continually optimizing and make sure that the process stays easy and fulfilling for them. Now we have switched to monthly because we're in more of a flow state with things and we're rolling with it. So, but yeah, I think doing it bi-weekly was really great to build up success and like really launch the podcast further. And as you mentioned, we're offering support every time, and we want them to have a voice and feel empowered. So we always ask for their feedback on guests, as you mentioned before, also on promotion strategies. We involve them with every aspect of the podcast, and we want their take on everything. We share data with them, the key metrics for our success. We're always letting them know how the podcast is doing and performing. So we keep them updated on every aspect of the podcast, and we're always trying to include them.
Yeah, and they're really passionate. Like, they get more passionate about it because of the inclusion. And I'll say, similar example with the Rose Holman podcast with student workers, they're super into it and are involved, from the promotion to the content strategy, to the, at some level, the guest selection. And they're also just thrilled every single time to engage. All right. So this is the conclusion of our presentation and what we want to talk about. So we'll go into question mode. And there's a question from Francis, which is, how many episodes do you produce per season?
We produce between 20 to 25 episodes per season currently. And I think that has been the case since the podcast launched, and we've continued that. So we pretty much publish year round. We take a winter hiatus for the break, but we don't really stop between seasons.
And what was just to dig a little deeper into that, what was the reason to do a year-long podcast?
I think we're hoping to continue building on our listeners and downloads and just keep boosting our performance. So we don't really want there to be a lag. We don't want to let up on that. We want to stay in people's minds. So I think that the best way of doing that is to just not really stop with sharing content and to keep it going.
All right, so we have a follow-up question here. Do you engage your guests in other opportunities at the school? For example, speaking opportunities?
Our alumni relations team does that. So our alumni relations team has very strong relationships with our alumni, and they really own that. That is not a marketing and communication responsibility. And typically the recommendations for our guests, a lot of them come from that team. So it's already people that they're engaging with in other ways. A lot of times we get recommendations from them after they've seen an alumni speak at a certain event that they are in charge of. So it's a very fluid relationship between us, but they really own that component.
All right. And give me one more minute for any other questions here, but we can move on to the final slide. So, it's a wholeheartedly thank you. This is some of our contact information. Upcoming how-to podcast sessions. So today we talk about how to give guests and hosts a great experience. And the next one is in the new year in January about how to grow your podcast audience. And that will be with Kate Young over at Purdue University, who is the producer and host of This is Purdue. And that's the exact same QR code that's been in the bottom left-hand corner. That's also access to a whole lot of different resources for podcasting specific for higher education. With this, Ananya, I just want to thank you again for taking the time and for being here. And is there anything else you want to say?
I just want to thank you for having me, and thank you for your partnership on the podcast. It's been a lot of fun, and we love working with you. So thank you.
Awesome.
And thanks to everyone for joining.
Yeah, thanks everybody. All right, have a great Friday and a great weekend. See you later.
Bye.